So let's go straight back to this story. Producers of the hit satirical show Spitting Image have had a curious meeting with ITV bosses about how, I love the idea of a curious meeting, about how best to portray black characters without being accused of racism. Show bosses are said to fear accusations of racism against the programme, which is set to feature caricature puppets of black celebrities such as Kanye West and Beyonce and the like. ITV Director of Television Kevin Ligo has said he had a meeting with producers to discuss whether black actors should voice black characters and whether only black writers should write for black puppets. Who'd have thought we'd be here? Let's speak with Michael Soyannwo, who is filmmaker and CEO of Rockindale Productions. Afternoon to you, Michael. Good to have you with us again, sir. I mean, it's a tricky one, this, isn't it? Because actually what we're talking about here is impressionists as distinct from just actors.
Yeah. Well, I'm a black person, but I don't sound particularly black. And very often when people have spoken to me on the phone and met me for the first time in real life, they haven't actually realised that I was black. So in terms of voicing a black character, all the Spitting Image are doing is basically voicing a character with regards to how they think they perceive a black person should sound, which again then tends to pander to stereotypes. With regards to the point of using black writers, well, I would point to the example of the most successful black comedy in America at the moment, Blackish. Now, Blackish has two black writers, one mixed-race writer and one white writer. Now, the advantage there is that black writers could then point out what's the difference between a stereotype and a stereotype that people would actually find funny and not offensive. And that's where I think that Spitting Image, where I think Spitting Image should learn from. That if you use black writers and black voices, they can then point out to them things that are funny and the things that are not funny because they're pandering to a really offensive stereotype.
I mean, I get exactly what you're saying, but I wonder whether it applies to Spitting Image, though, bearing in mind, I mean, if you're writing for Beyonce, you would be writing, one assumes, about her kind of TV profile, her Instagram image, her gigs, not about black life, but about showbiz life, as it were.
Well, I suppose.
So does it matter who writes that in that respect?
Well, again, I think it does, because a lot of the controversy surrounding someone like Beyonce at the moment is her relationship with the black community, and the fact that she seems to be reclaiming her roots more and more in a lot of the recent creative output that she's done. And some people say she's doing it to sell more records. Some people say she's just basically cashing in on the current political climate. So again, a good black writer could find the funny side of that without being offensive.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think you've written almost sketch one for Beyonce in Spitting Image, because that's arguably what that's the sort of thing they would pick up on, isn't it? Yeah. That there would be that kind of thing going on.
But it's got to be written the right way. That's the whole point. It's got to be written the right way without being offensive, and understand the comedy and where you can find the humour in that type of situation that she's currently in.
But when the original Spitting Image were writing for like Chris Eubank or Frank Bruno, for example, I mean, did it matter? I mean, we'll come on to the voices in a second, but in terms of the writing of it, would that have made any difference whether that was a black writer writing funny lines for Chris Eubank?
Well, a black writer would have written it a different way, because I think a lot of one of the reasons why a lot of black people became a little bit irritated by Frank Bruno was because he had this kind of image of good old Frank that wasn't too bright but was quite funny and good for a laugh and stuff like that, and people just found that kind of annoying. And again, so it's where you.
But that's a parody of a human being, isn't it? Not a black person.
Possibly, yeah. Well, possibly, but then it's kind of, you veer to that kind of certain. Was Frank Bruno slightly pandering to his own caricature?
Yeah, he was. This guy used to, like Lenny Henry, I can remember Frank Bruno doing suntan jokes on television, for goodness sake. Exactly. So, yeah, he probably was pandering to that a bit.
And I said, and a lot of black people found that uncomfortable. And as I said, there's different ways of writing it that you can find funny and find the right balance between what's funny and what's funny, but because you're pandering to a stereotype. For example, one of the most talked about impressions during that particular time was Jim Davison's chalky impression, which offended so many people for so many reasons. And in terms of the voice, if you want to talk about the voice, he didn't even sound West Indian. That was the biggest joke. He didn't even sound like a black person.
So he sounded like a white person's ear of a black person.
Well, it was just grotesque. The whole thing was grotesque, but obviously it made him a lot of money because white people think, yeah, well, that's the way that,
It's funny because a lot of people cite that as being the least offensive thing that Jim Davidson ever did, because he was talking about his mate, and that was how he imagined his mate talking.
Yeah, well, it's. I would take issue with that.
I don't think either of us are about to defend Jim Davidson, are we?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, when you're on the school playground and loads of people are doing chalky impressions.
Yeah, I get that. Of course, I understand that.
It was infuriating at the time.
In terms of voices, now the tricky thing about spitting image is distinct from a kind of cartoon where you might have a black character, but it's just a person. Yeah. But of course, this is about impressions, so you've got to find people who can do an impression, haven't you? Now, Alistair McGowan's spitting image was not always about, it was never meant to be the most accurate impression. It was a parody taking and drawing on traits and vocal behaviour and things like that. With Eubank, there was a sort of a bit of a lisp there, and of course the quality of the writing was about his desire to use sort of longer words and sound like the intellectual boxer. Now, does that have to be a black voice that voices Chris Eubank?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if speaking of spitting image, I mean, the Margaret Thatcher, the person who did Margaret Thatcher impression was actually a guy.
It was a guy, Steve Nallen, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it just depends how good the impression is. I mean, in terms of, I think what Alistair McGowan was doing with Chris Eubank was okay. I'll be less offended about something like that than the other types of humour that was around at the time, and also this belief that white writers know the difference between what's offensive and what is culturally quite funny. So there was a difference there, and as I said, as I could just about live with that.
So in terms of, I mean, I'm thinking about the kind of writers that were on that show, and I would. Perhaps, and I can't qualify this, Michael, but I think there were probably fairly enlightened, progressive types, if that makes sense, in the world of art. Does that make a difference?
Well, I suppose that they didn't, in terms of their progressive outlook, they didn't intentionally set out to offend black people, which was, their humour, I suppose, came from a good place. If there was such a thing, sometimes you can unintentionally offend people just by, as I said, pandering to stereotypes that aren't true. So, from that point of view, I don't have an issue with the writers. What I have an issue with are the producers of Spitting Image who could bring on more black writers, and then black writers could then say, well, that's okay. Yeah, you can have a pass on that. You can do that. But no, that we always get that, and it's not funny, and it's not right, and that's what they've done with Blackish, and it's been successful.
What about this? I've never thought of this before. Alex in Watford just emailed this through, Michael, and says every time they cast Bond, Idris Elba is suggested, who I think would be great, says Alex. But why can a black man play a white role, but the reverse is terrible? So I don't know whether Luther is a series of books, but if it was, would there be outrage if we were suggesting that, I don't know, a white actor played Luther?
Possibly, yeah. But then the thing about that's always made me laugh about James Bond is that there was, everyone said, well, Bond was written for a white character, fair enough. And it was an English character, and it was an English detective. But the Bond makers, there was one actor that the Bond makers would have played a king's ransom for 20 years ago, and that was Mel Gibson, who was Australian. Now, if Mel Gibson had been cast with James Bond, there would have been no outrage then.
Yeah, so then we get into the difference between colour and accents and nationality. God, it's fascinating, isn't it, really?
Well, I mean, that's what made me laugh. I mean, people were saying it was, Bond was, it's got to be a white actor because that was what it was written for. But, if you know anything about the history of James Bond, they offered twice Mel Gibson an absolute fortune.
Did they? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he turned it down twice. Now, if Mel Gibson had been cast as James Bond before Timothy Dalton, nobody would have complained. Nobody said, oh, my God.
He would have been horrendous as James Bond. That's just me looking back at things.
Well, in terms of performance, but nobody would have just pointed out that he's Australian.
Yeah, maybe not. I'm thinking about it as we're speaking.
That would have been an issue at all. So it's fine lines, and it's just at the end of the day, all black people really want in that genre is for more parts to be available. So James Bond, it doesn't really matter. What they would rather have is more. If you're going to create successful franchises and characters, it would be nice if more black actors were considered for another hit detective or another book and stuff like that, and spend the same money that they spend on James Bond.
All right,
that's what they really want.
Michael, it's great to have you on. Enlightening stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
Michael Soyannwo, who is, of course, a filmmaker, CEO of Rockindale Productions. What are you making of that? Because this one absolutely divides me on this, because I can see how if you were... I don't know, I can see certain areas where it would be really weird to get a white person to voice a black character, or a white person to play to do the voiceover for a black actor in The Simpsons. Didn't they recently survey black actors in the States who didn't have a problem with the fact that it had various white actors voicing black characters? Spitting Image, I'm just sensing, is different because it's about impression. So then you get into the question, should white people ever do an impression of a black person, even if that black person is somebody famous? What would happen if David Lammy became the Prime Minister? So does that mean Rory Bremner is the obvious example, who's impersonated every single Prime Minister for the last couple of decades? Would Rory Bremner have to say, sorry, I can't do this one because it's David Lammy? And the other issue, which you didn't have time to get into with Michael, and that's the look of the puppets themselves. I mean, the puppets and parodying the puppets. Does that become trickier in today's context for black puppets than white puppets? Would the accusation of racism, you can imagine somebody building, and you've got to remember the Spitting Image was about exaggerated features of different individuals and characters, whether it was their head, their hands, their ears, their nose, their eyes, their lips. It was all of those factors. So you'd be doing that with high-profile black people in today's context. Where would that sit with a modern-day audience? 0344 499 1000. You could, of course, override all of this and say, look, as long as no offence is meant, who gives a hoot? There is that. Not sure how that plays out with the intelligentsia.